Hello, everyone. My name is Helen Blyer. I am the Associate Dean for Lifelong Learning at Columbia Theological Seminary in steamy Decatur, Georgia. Um, I'm also the president of the guild that oversees lifelong learning leaders. It's called ALM, the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry. And my background is in religion and education. So I have actually been as you'll hear, part of this particular association for many, many years. I've been a member of both REA and then the organization that was folded into it, OPRE, the Association of Professors and Researchers in Religious Education, for more than 30 years. Um, for some folks, it might make me a relative newcomer compared to some others. In that time, I have seen massive change in this organization and in theological education writ large. That 30 years is a little bit more than the length of a generation, according to Google. And the depth of change that I've seen in my guild, Alam, in this guild, REA, in theological education, in seminaries, in ecclesial formation, um, seems to run on parallel tracks. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. It's also an amount of change that is not historically unprecedented. It has happened in an extraordinarily compressed period of time. So, for example, while the Reformation itself took a couple of centuries to hit its apex and culminate, we are experiencing a similar um, depth of change, but in the space of a very, very tiny pericope given the overall 2,000 years of Christian formation and organization. And wherever there's change, systems and the people who comprise these systems get anxious. I'm something of a disciple of Bowen family systems theory. If you're not familiar with it, it's an approach to understanding organizations as emotional systems. And one of the key tenets of systems theory is that the general patterns of all emotional systems are the same, whether you're talking about family of origin systems, work systems, social systems. The difference is in the intensity of the experience. Across all of these systems, the one constant is change, even though these systems themselves and the people in them often crave stability or what we call homeostasis, things remaining the same. Guilds like REA, like Alam, are a kind of system. So are churches. So are seminaries. And being at a seminary that has just experienced a whole lot of change, that has been all over the blogosphere and media sphere, I can tell you it jacks anxiety. So, as I've participated in and listened in on some of the conversations during the course of this conference, I've heard a lot of presentations, either directly or indirectly, reference this transitional time and all of the unknowns and challenges that it presents. I've seen Karen Marie Eust wrestle with what it means to be a guild at this time. I've seen international scholars toggle between the particularity of their contexts and the shared qualities of the work and challenges they engage across all kinds of difference. I've seen participants in my colleague Jody Porter's presentation wonder out loud about the dynamics of power and influence and the impact of new ways of approaching this work on the system. Hot take, it's not always a hospitable welcome. It's always good for an organization to get into their frontal lobes and thinking brains rather than their reactive reptilian stem brains when navigating times like this, especially when the anxiety is heightened. So going back to the changes I see in our guild and our field and lifelong learning and theological education and church, there are some consistent themes. And my tendency in such times is to climb the family tree and see what can be learned from the larger arc of the system's story when I get a little distance between myself and the immediacy of the problem. So, to that end, I'm going to take lifelong learning as something of a case study and see if there's something we can learn from looking at the steep transition going on in my professional field and get the perspective of a 30,000 foot view that might give us a new way of looking at what's happening in religious education as a discipline and in the institutions in which we do this work. I'm going to invite us to think about what larger insights we can gain from the story that might help us frame a new angle of vision on what's happening in our field. And I'm going to invite us to do reflective work that I know has already helped me and my colleagues in lifelong learning too. As we'll see, lifelong learning as a discrete field is under massive shifts at the moment and is, as the cool kids say, at an inflection point. As you'll see, our guild, Alam, has its own origin story that's a reaction or a response to a moment in time, which is the organic proliferation of lifelong learning programs in theological schools and denominations. So let's begin with establishing a point of perspective. And I want to point out the image that I have on the screen right now. The image is a Sankofa bird. The Sankofa bird takes its name from the Twi expression Sankofa. The literal meaning is go back and get it. So as you see, it's a bird with its feet pointed in one direction, but its head is pointed in another direction, and the beak is reaching for an egg, a symbol of growth, potential, life possibility on its back. So we're called, according to this Ghanaian tradition, to pay due regard to the lessons and practices of the past, the overarching story that we share in, and draw on them to inform the present and the future. And that's hopefully what I'm going to be doing some of today as we do a whistle-stop tour through the history of lifelong learning. So today's plan, in sum, is going to be to look at this as a case study, to look at the bigger story of lifelong learning in the Christian community as a broader landscape, and to ask some questions at the end about where we're headed, and like the Sankofa bird, what are we going to bring with us? So I'm going to begin with a little bit of a palate cleanser. Um, if you are familiar with this image from the recent Artemis 2 mission in April, I'd like you to just use the little function to show an emoji, a heart, a little hand, a thumbs up, something like that. I don't know about you, but I was absolutely transfixed. Yes, hearts all over the place. It's amazing. I was transfixed by the coverage of the whole moon mission. I couldn't get enough of the images, and I couldn't get enough of the narrative from the astronauts too, as they escaped Earth's atmosphere and looked at afar at our shared home. They looked down on our home planet from a greater distance than anyone else has ever done. And they had the unique opportunity to experience what's called the overview effect, a phenomenon that's caused by seeing Earth from space that can shift perspectives on life itself. Space philosopher, isn't that a great job title? I want to be a space philosopher. Space philosopher Frank White coined the phrase in 1987, and astronauts for decades have described a similar feeling, the realization that everyone back on Earth shares more in common than we realize. Borders and divisions are not visible. Trust us. You look amazing, astronaut Glover said on April 2nd. You look beautiful. And from up here, you also look like one thing. Homo sapiens, all of us, no matter where you're from or what you look like, we're all one people. Astronaut Cook had a profound message once they reconnected with Earth. She said, we will explore, we will build ships, we will visit again, we will construct science outposts, we will drive rovers, we will do radio astronomy, we will found companies, we will bolster industry, we will inspire, but ultimately, we will always choose Earth. We will always choose each other. There's a sense of hope and unity from this mission when both seemed in short supply. Or there's this image from the Webb Space Telescope a couple of years ago, 2023. What blew my mind about this image is that every single one of those blobs of light that you see is a whole galaxy. It is millions of stars. Each one of those things is a galaxy. Mind blown. The refrain of singer-songwriter Carrie Newcomer's new song, Parallax, which is a meditation on constellations, goes something like this. She says, looking forward, looking back, it just takes time and parallax. It's the promise of a silver moon shining sure, but always changing, changing soon. And she says further, we tell stories to create a frame, but it's always standing on what you call by name. So, with this wisdom in mind and feeling some pretty strong feels, both good and bad, about the work that we do, I decided to engage in a little parallax perspective to see how it changed my story, the things I called by name, about how things are going in this shared work that we have. So I'd like to take our shared understanding of what we're experiencing in our guilds, in our institutions, be they ecclesial or educational, and for a moment put them against a bigger landscape. We're going to see how the present and the future look when viewed from a new angle, a parallax vision that provides a view of something we might or not ordinarily see. And then we're going to ask what wisdom it might offer us as we discern a responsive and not reactive way forward. I recently conducted a longitudinal study of lifelong learning programs in theological schools, and as luck would have it, the longitudinal study covered the years 2020 to 2025. When we originally designed the study, we did not know that big things are going to happen in 2020. In short, I get the benefit on the daily of an overview effect. And I'm in regular conversation with other leaders in lifelong learning as I review the research. And it's going to be published in a forthcoming edition, a collection of essays that Jodie Porter announced on her session called Sustaining Ministry Education. It's going to be available for free on Atla Open Press, and I'll have information about it at the end of the session. So let's go to the origin story of ALEM, the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry, and take a little walk with me. So long, long ago, in a council far, far away, we had the National Council of Churches observing a phenomenon that looks something like what we're observing today. They were responding to research that had been conducted by Connolly Gamble. If we've got Union Presbyterian Seminary on the call, if we've got Union on the call, shout out to you guys. Connolly was the director of continuing education at Union. He had done research in 1959-60 to observe the proliferation of lifelong learning programs in theological schools. At that point, something like 95 of the 100-some schools that were in existence at the time and approved by the American Association of Theological Schools had lifelong learning programs. They were springing up like mushrooms. So the National Council of Churches took note of this and said, holy cow, we've got all of these programs that are developing to help ensure the continued efficacy of ministry practice. But we have no assurance of quality among these programs and no coordinating agency to help oversee the shared efforts of these programs. So they decided to build a guild that would herd cats and create a community of practice among all the programs with leaders for continuing education for ministry. It's called SACEM, SACEM, the Society for the Advancement of Continuing Education for Ministry. So the history of the establishment of SACEM after this continues over the course of time. 1969, they're established. There were enough members in this association, close to 200, to merit an annual boot camp that was sponsored in part by the Lilly Endowment to help new leaders of lifelong learning continuing ed programs know how to do their jobs effectively. So the idea was to provide camaraderie and exchange of ideas with training for continuing educators, very few of whom in early days had been trained for their roles. So there were ups and downs in the history of the org since then. In the 1970s, they experienced rapid expansion. Think about what's going on in the 1970s, both politically, socially, and ecclesially in the United States in particular. In the 1980s, they experienced a serious contraction and as a guild nearly turned the lights off. In the 1990s, they experienced a renewal. In the early aughts, they experienced another contraction. I don't know about you, but I'm getting dizzy from this roller coaster already. These rapid fluctuations, up and down, nearly closing, rejuvenating, up, down again, resulted in things like a name change to infuse new life in the organization, a quest to return to the mission. Today, we see ourselves on another upswing in the guild itself, as well as in the industry, with exponential growth in programs and the future to be determined. Those of us in leadership in Alam are trying to figure out how to how to set the tone for this change and this growth and not simply be whipsawed by reaction to what's happening out there. So, for a little bit of help in responding to this up and down arc, I turned to the wise voice of Justo Gonzalez in his book, short little volume called The History of Theological Education. Highly recommended to anybody who's in theological education to take a look at why this story might be happening in our particular guild. So, what we have today is, as I mentioned, a proliferation of programs. Mind you, they are not just in theological schools, they are also in freestanding shops. There's a whole lot of cottage industry growth in lifelong learning, non-degree, and other kinds of programs that are happening outside the purview of either accreditation or ecclesial oversight. Um, Thad Austin and Katie Camo, in their study on clergy well-being, have observed that continuing education, lifelong learning remains a huge pillar of supporting ministry folk, but it is largely unregulated and deeply fragmented. So there's very little opportunity for conversation among these various providers, meaning that we're experiencing some of the same problem that we experienced in 1969, except more so. So I don't know about you, but I'm tired already. It would be easy to be exhausted looking at this story, playing whack-a-mole, trying to respond in real time to all of the changes. And I know there's a kind of weariness in the guild as well for REA, for folks who are doing religious education, as we observe this similar kind of whipsawing within the field itself. So we're going to engage in a little parallax thinking inspired by the good Professor Gonzalez and see what happens when we scope way, way out. So, if lifelong learning has any kind of origin story, it's going to be in the book of Acts, actually. The book of Acts tells us about how the first so-called Christians, after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, tried to get together and share the wisdom of their community and articulate a common understanding in a diasporic experience of what it meant to participate in as a disciple and lead these early communities. So we're going to begin with about 33 in the Common Era. And if you take a look at the timeline, the next big thing that happens is really around 312. And then we've got the 13th century. These are major episodes in the history. And then you got this thing that looks like a barcode at the end of the timeline, which is a way of visually indicating the rapid and highly compressed change that the whole field of Christian religious education has experienced over time, which is part of the story of lifelong learning. So it's important to note that what we call lifelong learning and indeed seminary education today is arising out of a professionalization of ministry leadership education. What we see as the norm currently under steep transition is actually a relatively new phenomenon given the 2,000-year arc. A professional approach is the standard in other education for practices based professions. So, medicine, teaching, pastoral counseling, hairdressing, all of these have a professional approach to formation for people and credentialing for the practice. It underscores that there's a certain body of knowledge and a set of competencies one must have in order to be able to perform adequately in their position. So, side note, this professional approach to education has been key in forming leaders in Christian and religious education, too. Now, in such an approach, the education is constantly going to need updating because times change, needs change, and the communities that are being served are going to change. Research happens, situations arise that you don't anticipate. This whole approach elicits the gaps and growing edges in a professional approach to education. So people formed by this approach should expect that they're going to constantly need to update their knowledge and skills to function competently. So think about it. Would you want to go to a doctor, a medical practitioner who hadn't read a peer-reviewed article or gone to a seminar in 30 years? I know I wouldn't. It's a form of education that flourished and reached its apex in the optimistic years after U.S. victories in World War II and government incentives to seek education and prepare for post-war work in the United States. The cracks in this approach had already become evident in 1934 when the first study of the American pastor was published, and indeed led to the evolution of the American Association of Theological Schools as an accrediting body. The study showed that there is a deep gap between the education provided in seminaries and the actual skills pastors need to function effectively in their pastorates. And so the accrediting function arose to assure quality in education and ensure that the kind of education being offered was up to the task of people's professional expectations once they were out in the field. So today, as we fast forward to the current times, we seem to be experiencing an industry-wide critique of the professional approach, which is really what the unifying theme is behind the Theological Education Between the Time series edited by Ted Smith. In fact, in Dan Aylshire's contribution, he says that we need to find a formational approach to education and theological education, which will be good for our time now, given the constant chaos and disruption that we're experiencing. And it should be as efficacious as the professional approach to education was for a time. So we're at that inflection point. So let's go back to our roots. In the beginning, we did not have seminaries. We had the Didache, and we had mystagogia for our primary approaches to formation. The Didache is a short little ancient text the ancient fathers and mothers of the church developed to help give guidance on ethics and liturgical practice in the burgeoning early Christian community. As far as discipleship and Christian formation for the masses was concerned, mystagogia, the reflection on the mystery of the Eucharist and the lived experience of being part of this community, was the primary tool for Christian formation. So the story of education in its earliest form in the Christian community was one of formation in community. The early church understood the crucial importance of learning across a lifetime before we had formalized training programs for faith, community, and educational leaders. So the story of Christian education is a story of lifelong learning. The next big thing we have is Constantine's conversion, of course, in 312 Common Era, and that is the establishment of Christianity from this organic, diasporic, community-based way of life to a state religion, and people converted at sword point. Very different approach to what it means to be Christian. It became the official religion. It was mandated among people, and formation was took a different turn, shall we say. This was pretty much the state of affairs until the 12th and 13th century with the rise of scholasticism, the development of the first universities, and the establishment of theology as the academic queen of the sciences. We've got the rise of Thomas Aquinas here and the evolution of theology, reflection on the lived experience of Christianity as something that was the purview of academic elites, the few scholars who had access to it. Then in 1440, we had a shift that was a quantum shift similar to the rise of the digital sphere today, the evolution of the printing press. Think about what the printing press, which now created access to the body of content to all people who had literacy in their toolkit, what did that do to knowledge and formation? Who now had access to knowledge and knowing? The next big development we have is the 15th to 16th century with colonial exploration and the Protestant and Catholic Reformations with the establishment of the first centuries. People began to be aware of some of the significant malformation that had happened. Clergy were not subject up until this time to the kind of elite theological formation scholars were. Their formation happened differently. So the leaders in the communities themselves were trained, if at all, differently than the scholars in the first universities. And the Protestant and Catholic Reformations were a response to some of the abuses that happened as a result of that. Seminaries became established as a way of correcting those errors. And the way seminary education happened went largely unchanged until 1960s, the Vatican Council. You'll notice that we still don't have attention to the formation of lay believers and discipleship happening in any significant way through this whole period. It's just the leaders of the communities. In 1960, Vatican II Council um, threw open the windows, the aggiornamento within the Catholic community. Mainline Protestant communities followed suit with their own renewed approach to what it means to be church and how to form people. And with worship now happening in the Catholic Church in the vernacular, the church communicated that the work of the people, the liturgy, and the work of faith was the work of everybody, not just the elite educated few. Well, one of the things that happens in 1960 is you have all of these pastors. Remember, this is about the same time Connolly Gamble is doing his study on continuing education. They were trained in an old way, had to pivot for this radical change, didn't have the skills, and so you have this incredible mushrooming of lifelong learning programs as a reaction or a response to the gap in skill set needed for effective leadership in these communities. So let's fast forward to our recent history. Kablooey. We've got basically this highly compressed series of rapid transitions that I'm just going to give you a very, very fast overview of. In the late 50s and 60s, as I mentioned, we've got the rise of professional education, the rise of continuing education for the professions. Seminaries move towards deepened commitment to training people for ministry. Vatican II blew up the church world. You've got the development of liberation theologies. You've got this heady post-World War II optimism in the United States. You've got the GI Bill, the awareness of lingering inequity and the rise in the civil rights movements, in women's rights movements, and so on, and the Vietnam War. You've got the assassinations of prophetic voices at the head of calling for some of the necessary changes in our communities, another kind of civic reformation, if you will, followed by deep mistrust in authorities, all in the space of about 15 years. It all blew up. At the same time, I want to point out liberation theologies changed the locus of epistemology to the local community rather than the top-down model that had really shaped a lot of the education that was happening. In the middle of this, too, you see the rise of continuing education and lifelong learning as a reaction to what's happening. In the 70s and 80s, the tumult continues. You've got explosions in seminary enrollment, part of that due to the opening of ordination to women in many mainline Protestant denominations. You've got the rapid growth in congregations, followed by a rapid decline. You've got the rise and shift of the evangelical movement, the deep changes in the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest of the evangelical covenants. You've got the beginning of all of the schisms that have marked particularly mainline Protestantism. You've got Watergate, the pullout from Vietnam, economic crisis, inflation. Who remembers waiting in line for gas in the mid 1970s? Reagan era deregulation in the 1980s, and Wall Street's heyday, the go-go 80s. All of this tumult then leads to the 90s, where the church schisms continue, the rise of hyper-individualism, bowling alone, the development of personal computers and Apple computers, which means that people now have access to the treasure trove of the world's knowledge in their laps. They no longer have to go to libraries or rely on the interpretation of a skilled and educated elder for this. We've got a wiki world, a what I know is world, the decline of participation in congregational life, organized religion, bowling alone, redefining ministry and church, 9/11, which fundamentally rewrote the story the United States wanted to tell about itself. 2006, the last year of steady increase in seminary enrollment for degree programs, shifts in population demographics, the Great Recession. I'm getting exhausted again. This is just again in another couple of decades. All of this is happening. And then we wonder why our theological schools are anxious and why we feel that there's such dismantling going on in the work that we're doing. Look outside the window. It is happening in the landscape in which we are trying to do this work. Meanwhile, we've also got the pandemic. In the last 5 years, we've got the rise of Zoom and online connection. We've had COVID. We've had the murder of George Floyd and the new awareness of systemic racism in the United States that was presented by that. Deep political division, the Great Resignation, more schisms in churches, Lilly Endowment pumping untold millions of dollars in the industry of theological education and Christian ecclesia life to try to boost it and make sure that it's going to be okay and survive. All of this research going into the impact of all of these social pressures on the clergy who are trying to lead congregations that are hot spots and intersections of all of these dynamics with people behaving badly within their walls. You've got the shift in pathways grants. In the 2 rounds of pathways, Chris is on the call, and he can actually say a word about how many millions of dollars and how many theological schools have received large grants to institutionally explore other ways of going about ministry education. And it is in this context that there's been a huge proliferation of lifelong learning programs and non-degree programs as an approach to doing this kind of formational work. So you've got rapid changes. I haven't even gone into stuff like AI or the experience of being a single human being who has witnessed all of this change over the course of a single lifetime, when in previous iterations of human history, this would have taken multiple generations and even centuries to unfold. And then there's the dismantling of shared stories, local news sources, and any notion that there could be a common notion of truth or a tale that we tell about ourselves. So we've gone back to organic, localized efforts, but with the added influence of hyper-individualism. It's different from the hyper-organic approach to Christian community formation in the Didache and with mystagogia, where that formation happened in community. Now it's fragmented and up to the individual, and there's no shared sense of what the mission or the vision is for this work. So, what I wonder is, are we back to the beginning? Looking at this very whistle-stop exploration of the story of lifelong learning across centuries and the deep experience of change and transition we're having right now, along with the mushroom-like growth in our programs. Just to give you an idea of how many programs we have, um, in 3 years, the Association of Theological Schools reports a 51% increase in enrollment in non-degree programs. And our research in Alam has shown that over the same 5-year period, a 60% increase has happened in schools identifying themselves as having lifelong learning and non-degree programs. That's a lot of growth in a very short period of time. So what we're going to do, I'm going to invite us to think in some small groups for a couple of minutes about what insights from this overall arc might enhance your understanding of what's happening in the field of religious education, or if you prefer, have we really gone back to the beginning, or is something fundamentally different? What I'd like to do is to invite folks to go into groups. Denise is going to work her magic, and let's give you guys, Denise, do we have time for 10 minutes in these groups? Is that okay?
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's do 10 minutes in these groups. We'll reconvene and let's see, after you've gone through a G6 travel in time, what insights you might have to share for where we might go in navigating the anxiety of our guilds.
All right. Rooms should be open.
If you could drop the 2 questions in the chat or broadcast them, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you. Looks like Dean might be in his own room.
I'll help him find a room. Give me just
Maybe
one
room one,
moment.
because there are only 2 folks in room one.
Sure. Oops, the question went away. Can we come back
Oh,
to the
sorry.
question? It's okay. Just about there.
I was reflecting to Denise that you can tell when people are talking in the groups because there's a little microphone that goes up and down for the small groups, and that's just so satisfying. So it looks like there's some good conversation that was happening. And I am wondering if you would like to share some insights in response to either of the questions that we had, either what new insights from the overall arc enhance your understanding of what's happening in RE, or have we really gone back to the beginning? What's similar and what's different? And since we're a small enough group, because all the introverts headed for the hills, you can just go ahead and unmute and share in the space. Yeah, Joseph, you are muted, friend.
Thank you. Will there be a transcript of your presentation? You
Uh,
covered
it,
from Acts to 2026 in about 20 minutes.
Kind of like the way the change feels these days.
Yes, yes.
I will be happy to. I think the recordings of the sessions, Denise, are they available afterwards? Yes. So you should have
Okay,
access to a recording.
okay.
Joseph, you can also get anything that was in the chat. And I believe you can get the transcript as well by choosing the three dots.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. You understand who you're working with.
Anybody else? Dean, I see that you're unmuted, friend.
Yeah, just a couple of observations. One of them, I think, that trying to cover everything in 20 minutes. So let's just, so, one thing professors are gifted at is to raise the one thing that if you had 3 more minutes to talk about, you would have done. So we'll just do that. I'll just say
Hmm.
that. I think one of the things more proximate to our era might be how we also think about this in relationship to the commercialization or commodification
Hmm.
of education,
Yeah.
including lifelong learning. I am thinking about major universities that sponsor very elaborate trips.
We call that edutainment.
Yeah, well, yeah, and how that will also factor into some of what
Yeah.
what we think about. The other thing, and I'll just leave it as a question, is I'm trying to balance this idea of the local contextual learner and Jody's presentation.
Hmm.
where the presence of AI and hudagogy and a real focus more on self-determination. So I don't know if from what what at least I was wrestling with is whether that local context is so much the local community guiding the learner as the local community being the context that the learner is trying to dialogue with and interact with,
Hmm.
but their own agency is not dependent upon that community in quite the same way as perhaps the early church was involved. So it's just a thought, it's just a general kind of reflection at this point.
That's a really helpful way of naming the ways in which the current situation is different from the origin story. So we're kind of back to where we started from, but as you're pointing out, not really. And recognizing that relationship between the agency of the learner and the function of the community is really important. Um, what I'll also say is that in the origin story of Christian formation, the notion of an individual as separate from a community was not what it is today. And so we're imposing our own sort of modern understanding of individualism too on this. Is it a red herring? Is it an evolution of self-understanding? Well, Bowen would talk about individuation, self-differentiation as part of the arc of human maturation. Um, but I think you're right to attend to what the function of the community is in providing the context for or supporting the development of the agency of the person. Ideally, in my opinion, we don't learn outside of communities. We can only learn in incarnated ways, and that happens through real experiences with real people. We might as well be intentional about it and be clear about the kind of formation that's happening. I mean, taking James K. A. Smith's work on the liturgies of the marketplace, there's formation that's already happening out there at the hands of communities. And late stage capitalism hasn't done any favors to us as a church, as people of faith, as educators that are trying to reach for something perhaps different. Thank you. Mary.
I had the gift in my small group of having people who had extensive experience in India and in
Hmm.
Kenya. And one of the things I think I was struck by with your masterful 20 minutes set of the history is that it's a pretty Western oriented version of the history, which I
Yep.
totally get because, your Alam is in North America and, a lot of us function in that space. But I was struck by how much a couple of the people in the group I was in talked about not only trying to figure out who they were in their community, now having pushed back against some of the Northern stuff,
Yeah.
and also how things like the prosperity gospel, which had been imported from one set of missionaries, were now coming into another space and shaping. And I think these confluences and rivers of meaning making, I think it's hard to disentangle.
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out what it means to do formation in community in the midst of all of these competing streams is, I think it's, I mean, there's a part of me that wants to say, I think it's more challenging, but I don't know, that could just be the massive change we're going through.
Thank you. That's a really helpful observation. And if I had another 20 minutes, I would have loved to have put this against a global context. You're right. I'm taking ALAM because ALAM is a North American organization in its origins. It's from the National Council of Churches. Um, Although we now have members who are in Europe, based in Europe and based in Australasia. Um, but we're still operating out of that story. So what I'm interested in is finding out how the navigation of the current change as we're experiencing it within this guild can lead to meta insights that might help us understand what's happening in other places. And I think the tension that you're naming, having heard it in your group, um, is an example of that kind of tension, along with the very unfortunate exports of American Western colonial religion that our our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world are still disentangling themselves from. Thelma.
Yeah. Oh, so one of the ideas that was brought in by Pamela was how we have inherited from the colonial masters,
Yeah.
the missionaries, the Christianity that we have inherited. And Uh, I know that many of the communities, the Christian communities in India, feel so indebted to the colonial masters because they brought education and employment that kind of brought prosperity to our communities. And we are now, all over the world, and we are trying to say, oh, India is great too, that kind of a language. So if I were to speak in a post-colonial language against the British, I usually hear from the Christian folks, even within social gospel, a social justice group, that I am not patriotic. I represent India
Yeah.
in very poor light. This is among the Indian Christians. So it is very difficult. But one thing that I have noticed is that when I go to secular institutions, the universities, the colleges that are not Christianity based, where most of the others are Hindus or Muslims, and you use critical thinking, and I've used like, okay, I will look at the Bible with a critical thinking insight, and what do I find problematic? And then I ask them to participate. So I make myself vulnerable and allow them the space to speak. Then I find that there's a lot of interreligious engagement that takes place and nobody feels threatened. But otherwise, we Christians are like trying to say we are the head, not the tail, or we are equal to you, the other religions. We are just 2%. So we have to show that we are strong or something. But it is much easier if we can use critical thinking and bring in religious education into, I think, social sciences in our classroom, and that helps.
So a couple of observations from your comments. Thank you so much. One is you justify the mission of the Sankofa bird, which is to move forward while looking back and bring what is valuable from the past into the present, and an unquestioning defense of or appropriation of the effects of colonialism does not constitute discernment. I mean, if you're going to grab the egg, you're going to grab what's valuable. The legacy of education and some of the development that happened. But there are parts of it that are not valuable. Second observation is part of the overall story of Christian formation. The dominant story is a top-down epistemology. It is a hierarchy. It is an educational caste system, if you will, with folks who have and have not. So even though all of this wiki world, what I know is access to stuff, everybody's an expert, proliferates in common society, we still have most of our educational efforts relying on a kind of top-down approach to epistemology. So if I had another 20 minutes, I think what I'd do is dig in with us the changes that are happening to epistemology at this point. And when you start messing with who knows, what is knowledge, where does it come from, who has access to it, who creates it, you're starting to mess with some of the very ways power structures remain in control. And that's threatening. So when you're talking about using critical thinking, you're talking about getting into your thinking brain, as I said at the beginning, rather than the reactive reptilian stem that sees change as a threat and goes into fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode. So thank you for all of that. We're about at time. I do have two little slides to share. Hope you guys can see the presentation now. Two quotes. One of them is from one of our granddaddies in Religious Ed Association, Alfred North Whitehead, The Aims of Education, 1929. He talks about the essence of all education is to be religious, that it inculcates duty and reverence. It takes us outside of ourselves, and it inspires us to respond in ways that help the nurture and healing of the world. The other is T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding. I do apologize for ending with two white men from the 1920s. I think this is part of my Sankofa method to retrieve some of the bits that are good from the past. But T.S. Eliot's quote from Little Gidding, "We shall not cease from our exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Thank you for the Whistle Stop tour. When Atla Open Press makes available our new publication on lifelong learning, researchers, practitioners, leaders have all contributed to the chapters in this book. We'll announce it on our Alum website, and our Alum website is alum.org. So please come visit us. We've just redesigned the website. We're still working out some of the glitches. So if you see something that's wonky, email me, let me know. And remember that all learning is lifelong learning, and degree programs and other kinds of single efforts are simply one tiny pericope in the course of a lifetime of learning. Thanks, Denise, for your capable leadership of facilitating this digital space, and for all of you guys for sticking through the entire presentation. Grateful for you.
Thank you, Helen. This has been wonderful. Let's thank our very capable and gifted host. We appreciate you.